Today is to consider H.R. 5, the Parents' Bill of Rights Act. The COVID-19 pandemic caused significant disruption to life of every American, but one of the harshest impacts was inflicted upon America's children. Across the country, schools closed or shifted to a hybrid model with limited in-person instruction. For millions of students, that meant being pulled from the classroom and forced into virtual education that was inadequate and in many cases damaging. Unsurprisingly, student progress clearly plummeted. Reading scores suffered the largest decline since 1990, and mathematics scores dropped for the first time ever. Mental health problems among children soared as students struggled with the repercussions of isolation and loneliness. Indeed, the consequences of shifting children into virtual learning during the pandemic will be felt for generations to come. The situation also enabled some parents, for the first time, to see exactly what their children were being taught. Many were shocked to find divisive topics like critical race theory and progressive gender ideology pervasively included throughout the coursework. In response, parents understandably attempted to reclaim their oversight of their children's education from a coercive federal government. They called for schools to reopen, to prioritize the physical, social, mental, and educational well-being of children, and to refocus curriculum to essential topics outside of leftist ideology. While some states and school districts heeded these calls, many others did not. In many cases, parents who stood up to make their voices heard were branded as, quote, disruptive, unquote, and even as having the potential to commit, quote, domestic terrorism. Today's bill values the fundamental role parents play in the upbringing of their children. With the passage of H.R. 5, we will ensure that key parental rights are protected, and will ensure that our classrooms will be places of learning and growth, that parents, families, and educators and administrators are all on the same page. I know my friends on the Democratic side of the aisle have expressed concerns that this bill will ban books or constitute a gag order against teachers, but nothing could be further from the truth. Nothing in this bill would do those things. Instead, what the bill does is to ensure that parents have a voice in their children's education and ensure that schools are communicating directly with parents. Like every other institution in America, schools must be accountable, and this bill will ensure that accountability to the people who matter the most, parents who are clearly concerned about their children's education and their children's future. I now yield to my good friend, our ranking member, Mr. McGovern, for any remarks he cares to make.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me welcome the chairwoman and ranking member of the committee for being here today. Today we are meeting on H.R. 5, a bill that should be called the Politics Over Parents Act. So let's cut to the chase. H.R. 5 is not about helping students or empowering parents. It's an extreme bill designed to politicize our education system, pit parents against teachers, and bring divisive MAGA culture wars into the classroom. There are so many issues with this bill, I don't even know where to begin. It mandates things that schools across the country already practice, things like parent-teacher conferences, giving parents the ability to testify at school board meetings, public disclosure of school budgets, class plans, and library catalogs. It requires school districts to scrape together money from existing funds to meet onerous new regulations, potentially threatening the funding of other critical programs. It creates dangerous environments for LGBTQI+ kids by forcing schools to, quote, out their students even if they aren't ready for that. It turns Congress into a national school board, withholding essential federal funding if local school districts don't comply with our whims. And frankly, the irony is unbelievable. The self-proclaimed party of limited government and states' rights wants to nationalize our education system, turning Congress into a one-size-fits-all Board of Education for the entire country. Even the Cato Institute called this bill unconstitutional. Finally, chillingly, this bill is part of a nationwide MAGA march toward more censorship, more book bans, and more attempts to deprive our children of an accurate and fact-based education. And let me just say, as both a parent and the brother of two Worcester public school teachers, you know what our kids need? You know what our parents want? Better schools, more money to hire and retain staff, solutions that help partner educators with parents to support and empower students, legislation to address gun violence in our schools. That's what Democrats want to do instead of wasting time debating this ridiculous political stunt. Because Democrats are partners with parents. We want to increase parental engagement. We want every kid to have a safe, supportive learning environment. That's why we introduced over 25 amendments to this bill when it was marked up. Amendments to get lead pipes out of our schools. Amendments to address learning loss during the pandemic. Amendments to say this bill couldn't be used to ban books. Even an amendment to establish a parent coordinator at every elementary and secondary school. And what did the Republicans do? They voted down every single one of these amendments, every single one. H.R. 5 ignores the core day-to-day challenges that impact educators, students, and parents. Many school districts are suffering teacher shortages. Let's pay them more. 9 million kids in the United States live in food-insecure homes. Let's ensure they get healthy meals at breakfast and lunch. 94% of public school teachers use their own money on classroom supplies, spending an average of about $479. Let's get them the funding they need to do their job well. But none of that is in this bill, because the purpose here is not to help students or parents or teachers. It's to sow distrust and to continue to make classrooms ground zero for the MAGA culture wars. That's what this bill is about. House Democrats have put forward concrete ideas to improve public education, to make our schools safer, and address learning loss due to the pandemic. House Republicans have refused to join us in these efforts because they are more interested in politicizing our classrooms than solving problems. And it's a shame. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Without objection, any prepared statements that our witnesses may have brought with them will be included in the record. I'd like to welcome our first panel, Chairwoman Foxx, our former colleague. Always good to have you up here. And Ranking Member Scott, one of my very favorite witnesses. So, Dr. Foxx, I welcome you back to the Rules Committee, and I welcome your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's always fun to be at Rules. It's especially fun when we're in the majority. Chairman Cole, your opening remarks were excellent. Mr. McGovern, not surprised. I don't think yours were so excellent, but I'm glad to know in a nutshell what we're up against. I appreciate, members of the Rules Committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify in support of H.R. 5, the Parents' Bill of Rights, which is a cornerstone of the Republicans' commitment to America. The Committee on Education and the Workforce upheld House Republicans' promise for a future that's built on freedom by passing the Parents' Bill of Rights in committee. There are 5 pillars to the bill. First, it clarifies that parents have the right to know what their children are being taught. This means schools must disclose curriculum information and library reading materials. Signing this bill into law would provide parents protections against being blindsided by explicit materials in his or her children's classrooms. The bill further reinforces that parents have the right to be heard. This means fortifying an open channel between parents and their school board. No longer would parents have their speech denied or have to feel threatened for voicing their concerns at a school board meeting. The Parents' Bill of Rights Act establishes the important right of parents to see schools' expenditures. Public education is funded by taxpayer dollars. Mothers and fathers deserve financial transparency and to see how their money is being spent. This bill codifies the right of parents to protect their child's privacy. This bill gives parents, not tech companies, control over student data. This also means that parental consent would be required before any school medical exam takes place. Lastly, the Parents' Bill of Rights Act makes clear that parents have the right to keep their children safe. Safety is many parents' top priority. It's bipartisan common sense that they should be notified of violent activity on school grounds. There was plenty of robust debate over these provisions in markup. Many good amendments were offered, and I'm proud that the committee was able to approve a conservative bill that works for everyone. Parents are the #1 interest group in K-12 education. They are the stakeholders in America's future. It's about time we listen to them, and I'm proud that the committee was able to act swiftly and decisively on this legislation. I urge the members of the committee to support the Parents' Bill of Rights Act and an appropriate rule for its consideration by the House. Thank you, and I'm happy to answer your questions.
Ranking Member Scott, you're recognized for your testimony.
Thank you very much. Good evening, Chairman Cole, Ranking Member McGovern, members of the committee. I speak in opposition of H.R. 5, better known as the Politics Over Parents Act. And let me first be clear that House Democrats believe that parental engagement is central to student success. Parental engagement in schools is closely linked to better student behavior, higher academic achievement, and enhanced social skills. Unfortunately, this legislation does not take any meaningful steps to increase or support parental engagement. In fact, the ranking member quoted the Cato Institute when it said it suffers from a fundamental flaw that it's not constitutional. They also said that even if it was constitutional, it would not give parents real power. The H.R. 5 purports to give parents rights to review curriculum, to meet with teachers at least twice a year, review the budget, including all revenues and expenditures, address the school board of the LEA, and receive information about violent activity. But I can assure you that Democrats are not opposed to this. In fact, in virtually every jurisdiction in this country, that these so-called rights are present law or at least general practice. In fact, if we wonder if our colleagues understand the very thing, this is what parents are already doing. To be clear, there's no law that denies parents the opportunity to meet with their children's teachers or review the school budgets. These documents are public documents, subject already to the Freedom of Information requests, and the provision to create a federal cause of action requiring school boards to recognize the right of all parents without limitation to address the school board can't be serious. An amendment was offered to limit this so-called right to one with reasonable limitations. That was rejected. So exactly what does that mean? Does that mean if 100 parents show up at a school board meeting, each and every one with a 20-minute presentation has a federal cause of action against the school board if they're not allowed to make the presentation? I don't know what it means, but it's obviously if there are no reasonable limitations, it's not serious legislation. If passed, the bill will also create unnecessary and burdensome reporting requirements on schools that would divert essential resources and personnel away from meeting families' real needs. That's why, as the ranking member mentioned, we offered 25 good faith amendments to meaningful increase the partnerships between schools and families. H.R. 5 is one Republican is one with which Republican politicians across the country, some successful, want to give a vocal minority the power to impose their beliefs on all parents and students. In fact, in the last 3 academic years, legislators in 45 states proposed 283 laws that either sought to ban books, censor curriculums, restrict student civil rights, intimidate librarians, or punish teachers for accurately recounting our nation's history. And make no mistake, when we talk about banning books, the provision of this law will set up a situation where a national organization, if they picked a book they want to ban, they will be able to instantaneously launch a national campaign to ban that book. Of those proposals, 64 have actually been signed into law across 25 states, covering over 40% of the American population. These bills and others censor students' learning, have real consequences for students and educators. For example, legislation prevented an 8th grade teacher in Iowa from teaching his students that, quote, slavery was wrong. In North Carolina, his high school social studies teacher was no longer to assign reading from certain chapters of Christopher Columbus's journal because it explains his involvement with slavery, and a school district in Arkansas banned Anne Frank's Diary of a Young Girl for all middle and high school students because it was, quote, overly dark and heavy. Simply put, H.R. 5 in educational gag orders across the nation prevent students from learning and prevent teachers from teaching. These efforts seek to score political points and scare parents into thinking that schools do not have their best interests at heart. Instead, we should be talking about the support the schools and families actually need to improve their partnerships. And so I urge my colleagues to oppose H.R. 5 as it is and join House Democrats in supporting Ranking Member Bonamici's amendment in the nature of a substitute, which will deliver real solutions that will increase partnerships between schools and families and help students succeed. Specifically, that would create some of the things that the ranking member pointed out, a parent coordinator at every school that would help actually encourage parents to come and get engaged, participate in PTA meetings, increase funding for statewide family engagement centers, increase funding for full-service community schools, prevent schools from banning books, and prevent censorship of Black history, Latino history, Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander history, Native history, LGBTQ plus history, women's history, and the history of the Holocaust or anti-Semitism. I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you and welcome you, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. The chair has no questions at this time, so I'd go to Dr. Burgess, the vice chair of the committee, for any questions he might care to pose.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Foxx, good to see you again. Again, I am proud to occupy the Foxx chair on the Rules Committee. Ranking Member Scott, thank you for your presentation as well. I don't have many questions, but since the issue of banning books keeps coming up, Dr. Foxx, does this bill ban any books?
Absolutely not.
So if I were to ask you for a list of books that would be banned, you would not be able to provide it?
Correct. I would not be able to provide a list of banned books.
Because none, in fact, are banned.
Correct.
You know, some of us were here when Katrina was a was a storm that hit New Orleans, and working through the problems in the aftermath of that storm, so many of the kids had to leave the New Orleans area. Many came to Dallas, Houston, several cities in Texas. And I remember we worked through the problem of with the federal aid that was being provided in the aftermath of Katrina, the concept of the money follows a student. So I was grateful to see Representative Roy had an amendment that follows along those lines. Let me just ask you, did that come up at all in the underlying discussion of the bill itself, a money follows a student concept?
We did not discuss that in the committee markup.
Seems like and if my memory serves me correctly, it did work well for that difficult time in the aftermath of Katrina when so many students were displaced from their home districts, and it allowed their education to continue uninterrupted. And it's hard to imagine that would not be a policy that would be useful for us to continue to consider. But beyond,
It
yes.
would be the ideal situation in our country, I believe, if we could implement that. And my understanding is that as a result of Katrina and the changes that were made specifically for Louisiana, that education has improved dramatically in Louisiana.
Well, I thank our witnesses for their presentations today. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Thank you very much. Chair now recognizes distinguished ranking member for questions he might.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Look, I've heard some of my colleagues say that this is not about banning books, but give me a break. Look what's happening in this country. Republican-led legislatures are going on a censorship spree that would make the Chinese Communist Party blush. We have 25 states that have passed laws telling students what they are and aren't allowed to learn about in school. We have Republican leaders calling to investigate librarians. We now have 1,500 banned books in schools across the country. We have teachers in Iowa being told they can't teach that slavery was wrong. We have teachers in Texas being told that if they have a book on the Holocaust, you have to have a book that teaches, and I quote, the opposite perspective. We have Republicans in Tennessee trying to ban a Pulitzer Prize-winning book about the Holocaust. We have Republicans in Wisconsin trying to ban an award-winning book because it mentions Japanese internment during World War II. If this were happening in another country, our State Department would be sounding the alarm, but it is happening here. And against that backdrop, here we have a bill that makes it easier to censor ideas and ban books. That makes it easier for one racist or homophobic person to dictate to an entire class, an entire school, what kids can and can't read. That creates onerous steps to make schools justify which books are on the shelves if a single parent complains. That is not how freedom works. A free society isn't afraid of ideas. To my colleagues who claim to be libertarians, can you seriously vote for this bill and claim to care about freedom when you're voting to restrict what books are on the shelves? Even the Cato Institute says this bill is unconstitutional. That should tell you something. So let me just make this really concrete for people. I have a pile of books on my desk in my office that I get from the Library of Congress, books that have been banned. And I have more coming every day. Luckily, my Republican friends haven't censored the Library of Congress yet. Maybe that will be next. But let me just read from one of these books. It's called The Life of Rosa Parks by Kathleen Connors. It was pulled from second-grade classrooms in the Duval County Public School District in Florida. So let's just see what is so objectionable. Quiet beginnings. When Rosa Louise Macaulay was born in 1913, no one knew she'd make a stand for civil rights. Rosa lived on her grandparents' farm in Alabama. She went to a segregated school where her mother taught. Rosa had to leave school to care for her grandmother and mother when they became ill. But after she married Raymond Parks in 1932, she was able to go back, and Rosa was proud of her high school diploma. Rosa and Raymond believed everyone should be equal. They joined the NAACP in Montgomery, Alabama, hoping to help blacks gain their civil rights. Rosa worked as a secretary for the group. In 1955, Rosa boarded a bus after work in Montgomery. At the time, there was a law that said a black person had to give up their seat if a white person needed it. Rosa refused, and she was arrested. On the day of Rosa's trial, black leaders planned a boycott of all the city buses in Montgomery, Alabama. It was a big statement because many blacks use buses to get around. Rosa was fined, but she wouldn't pay. By 1956, her case had reached the U.S. Supreme Court. It declared Alabama's segregation laws illegal. This decision ended the bus boycott after 381 days. Rosa's troubles weren't over. She lost her job. Some people said they wanted to hurt her. She and her family then moved to Detroit, Michigan in 1957. None of this stopped Rosa from believing in equality. Rosa's continued support of the civil rights movement earned her great praise. In 1996, she was given the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Then Rosa received the Congressional Gold Medal in 1999. Rosa died in 2005. Today, she's often called the mother of the civil rights movement. Rosa's story teaches a very important lesson. Even small actions can have a big impact. So my question for Chairwoman Foxx, it's very simple. It's a yes or no question. You know, Rosa Parks has a statue in National Statuary Hall. She laid an honor here in the rotunda of the United States Capitol building when she died. And so this is a simple, non-controversial children's book about her life. Do you think that this book should be banned? Yes or no?
I have no idea why the book was of controversy in the second grade. It sounds like a perfectly wonderful story to me. I love the story of Rosa Parks, always have loved the story of Rosa Parks because she was a really brave woman, but I have no idea. You're asking me to give you an answer out of context, Mr. McGovern. I have no idea why that book was taken out of the second grade. I don't know reading levels.
Well, I
It sounded a little high.
I read the
Reading
whole.
level for second grade, to me, as you read it, that was, I thought second graders might not understand every word in there, so I have no idea.
Well, I read the whole book.
I know.
So there was, and I think the concern that many of us have, given what is happening in this country, led by Republican governors and Republican legislatures all over the country, is that somebody just merely raising a question about a book like this. I mean, by the way, books about Martin Luther King, books about Nelson Mandela, they've also been banned. I have a long list that I'd like unanimous consent to insert in the record, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection.
And, and some of the commentary is that some people who object to this don't like the fact that she is referred to as a black woman, that it would be better to simply say she was asked to move to the back of the bus. And so there's all these kind of like ridiculous excuses for books like this to be banned. And the concern is that if this bill passes, and God forbid it ever became law, that it would have a chilling impact on schools and on libraries, where they would be afraid that if they didn't comply with all the onerous requirements of your bill, if somehow they, were accused of not following everything perfectly, that they would lose all federal funding for their schools.
Mr. McGovern, there is not a single requirement in this bill dealing with banning of books. So I don't know what you're talking about in terms of the list of onerous requirements on banning books. There's not a single word in here about banning books.
Yeah. Well,
I have
first of
no
all,
idea what you're talking about.
well, two things. First of all, I mean, just in answer to my question, yes or no, you think this book should be banned? And the answer is?
Well, obviously, I don't think the book should
Okay,
be banned,
okay.
but again, you're taking out of context. I have no idea. You said it's been banned.
It has been banned, and I gave you the, in Duval County
Duval
Public
County,
School
but-
and district in Florida.
Well, I don't know what that means, so.
Well, that's a
I
district
need
in
more-
Florida.
I need more information on what you mean by banning a book.
Have you been following any of the debate on books that are being removed from schools? I mean, there's a book entitled "I Am Martin Luther King" that was banned from some schools. I mean, you're the Education Committee. I mean, are you guys following any of that?
Mr. McGovern, I follow as much information about what's happening in terms of education as I possibly can, but I have not seen anything on that. But your definition of ban is something I don't understand. I don't know what the definition is.
Ranking Member Scott, do you share my concern that this bill might result in the banning of more books?
Yes, and although technically it does not ban any books, it sets up a matrix where the school board has to name every book in its library, making it easy to sort, select, and find. If a national organization has selected that book, they can instantaneously find throughout the country every other library that has that and launch a campaign to censor that book. And each and every little school board would be faced with either you got to ban the book or you're going to face a lawsuit.
Right. So basically,
And you've got limited money and limited time to deal with stuff. And so they can launch a national campaign and be banning books all over the country. And this bill will create the logistics to make that easy.
and essentially, I mean, if a school doesn't jump through hoops and comply with all this red tape, they could lose their federal funding. Is that the result of this bill?
It's a requirement in the bill that they have a record, and if they buy a new book, they've got to update the website to show that they've got the book, and you can launch a national, instantaneously launch a national campaign finding every library, school library in the country that has that book, and send a notice to sue if it's not banned, and that's what this bill will make easy.
Yeah, and essentially, the concern that many of us have here is that this would have a chilling effect on the freedom of kids all across the country to read all kinds of books. And that, you know, school districts might not want to end up in dealing with any kind of controversy because of a small number of people that might raise objections, and so they just might move to ban the book.
How many school boards want to defend a lawsuit on banning a book? I mean, if you have a national organization coming in banning books, they file a lawsuit, and all of a sudden, the school board is faced with either you defend the lawsuit or you ban the book.
I'd like to ask unanimous consent to insert in the record a letter from the American Library Association opposed to this, they raised the issue that they fear that this bill would create a catalyst for more book banning and censorship. And I'd like to ask unanimous consent to put that in the record.
Without objection.
And again, I looked at the committees, the amendments that were offered in committee, and some of them seemed to be like totally non-controversial, yet they were all rejected. You know, I mean, people voted no on preventing schools from banning books, no on parent-teacher coordinators, no on getting rid of lead pipes. They seem to be more concerned about getting Rosa Parks out of our schools than getting lead pipes out of our schools. So I get it. People don't want to talk about how this bill would promote banning books or hurt students, but you know, but it does. So I also just want to say, for the record, Mr. Chairman, that the polling on these issues is not in favor of what Dr. Foxx is presenting here today. Hart Research did a poll, and it says fully 65% of the voters and 74% of parents say that teachers in their schools generally stick to teaching appropriate academic content and skills education, while just 27% of voters and 21% of parents believe teachers often go too far in promoting, quote, a woke political agenda in the classroom. 2/3, 66% of voters say that culture war battles distract distract public schools from their core mission of educating students. An overwhelming 85% to 15% margin, voters want the new Congress to focus on providing support and resources to public schools, not carrying out political investigations. I ask unanimous consent to put that in the record.
Without objection.
Yeah. The bottom line, and I'll close with this, I never in a million years, when I first got elected to Congress, thought that we would be having a conversation like the one we are having now. It really is disturbing. And, you know, and I feel very strongly that people who care about freedom, that people who are against censorship, the people who think that banning books is a horrific thing to do. We even have a legislator in Tennessee who's talking about burning books. I just think this is not what we should be focused on right now. We should be focused on getting our schools the resources they need so that our kids can get the best education possible. I think that's what most parents want, not us going down this road. But in any event, I thank you both. And did you want to say something, Dr. Foxx?
Mr.
Okay.
Chairman,
Sure, absolutely.
if I might, since Mr. McGovern is inserting into the record his poll numbers, I'd like to insert into the record our poll numbers. According to survey results, and we have the footnotes on these so we can give you the source, 72% of Americans support curriculum transparency, 67% believe that parents should be able to opt their children out of curriculum they believe is inappropriate or harmful. Nearly 8 in 10 parents polled nationally want to have influence over what is taught in K-12 classrooms.
Well,
so
you brought that up. Let me ask you, Mr. Scott, Congressman Scott. I mean, Elementary and Secondary Education Act already ensures that parents have a bunch of rights. I mean, to be involved in the development of a school support and improvement plan to improve student outcomes, to receive information on how parents can be involved in the education of their children and to be active participants in assisting their children, to meaningfully participate in the development of a district parent and family engagement policy. I mean, this notion that somehow parents can't do anything or have no ability to have any input on what is going on in schools. I mean, that seems to be contrary to what already exists.
Well, first of all, the parents help elect the school board.
Absolutely.
But all of that coordination and collaboration is already happening, and this bill doesn't give them anything that they don't have already. I would agree that 72% like transparency. I'm surprised it's not 100%. Everybody, but this bill doesn't give them anything they don't have already. I mean, the right to address the school board, with the language of the bill, says it's without limitation. They rejected an amendment with reasonable limitations, which means that if 100 people show up at a school board meeting, does each and every one have a federal cause of action if they don't get to speak for as long as they want?
And what is the answer to that?
I didn't write the bill.
I don't, do you know what the answer to that, Dr. Fox, is?
Well, I do believe that it says it was a reasonable right. I was trying to find that amendment
Yeah.
itself.
No, that's
I could not find it.
you the chair recognizes the language because that was the amendment that they rejected with reasonable limitations.
Okay. Well, yeah, and again, what this bill does is it holds the threat of losing all federal support for schools in a particular district. I thank you both. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. And, you know, I think there was one prominent Democrat that summarized the Democratic position on all this, and that's Terry McAuliffe, who said, and I quote, "I don't think parents should be telling schools what they should teach," end quote. He said that on 29 September 2021. That's the entire genesis of this. It's very clear that Republicans believe that parents and local school boards should control what's being taught. Democrats think that it should be some elite, woke ruling class that tells you what should be taught, and the parents have no role, and that's really the genesis of that. While we're talking about book burning, it's amazing that my colleagues across the aisle have just discovered book burning. When it was going on just a year ago, there was absolute silence from my friends on the left. I want to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a piece from Newsweek, Big Tech's digital book burning threatens a free and open society, from 17 March 2021.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So this this piece is great because it chronicles how Amazon and other online bookstores will, in essence, digitally burn a book, meaning they'll take it offline. And they did this with Alec Berenson's Unreported Truths About COVID-19. They claimed it was quote-unquote misinformation. Turns out most of what was in that book turned out to be true. It wasn't misinformation. It was information that the left didn't agree with because it didn't fit their narrative. Additionally, they took down Ryan T. Anderson's When Harry Became Sally. They said this was hate speech. Interesting, because at the same time they took that book down saying it was hate speech, they were still selling Mein Kampf. They also, by the way, were selling The Pedophile's Guide to Love and Pleasure. So Amazon can sell Mein Kampf and books on pedophilia, frankly, a guide to committing pedophilia, but when it comes to getting out the truth on COVID-19, can't do it. When it comes to a position on transgender surgery they don't agree with, that gets burned. So again, it's convenient that all of a sudden now my friends across the aisle have discovered book burning. But what
Will the gentleman yield for a second?
no, it's my time. Sure, Mr. Chairman.
No, I just
Yeah.
wanted to point out, Amazon is a private company, and we're talking about public schools here.
Thank
Okay.
you, I appreciate it. The difference is the silence from your side of the aisle when this was going on. Would you like to condemn Amazon for digital book burning?
I don't believe in censorship.
Okay, so you're condemning Amazon for removing these books?
I'm waiting for somebody to condemn the banning of books in all of our public schools that are going on as a result of Republican legislatures and Republican governors. So, you know, we can both condemn together if you want to do that. But I would really appreciate somebody saying that it is wrong that I Am Martin Luther King is banned from some public schools, or the Rosa Parks book is banned from some public schools. That would be helpful.
Well, Chairman McGovern, I'm going to give you the chance to to criticize some banning of books. The Burbank Unified School District banned Of Mice and Men. They banned Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. They banned some Dr. Seuss titles, and they banned To Kill a Mockingbird. By the way, it was the right who was criticizing this. No one on the left that I'm aware of criticized this. Would you like to condemn this book banning?
I read To Kill a Mockingbird when I was in school. Book, and obviously, we need to put some things in perspective, but I'm not for banning books.
Well, thank you for your intellectual honesty. I mean that sincerely.
Like, how about answer my question?
Wait, what was your question again?
All the books that have been banned.
Oh, I'm
as
getting
being-
to that. I'm getting to
Okay.
that. I'm getting to that. Thanks. The fundamental misunderstanding here is there's a difference between banning books, which Republicans don't agree with, and making sure that books are appropriate for certain age groups. And fundamentally, that parents, via school boards, make those decisions. That's it. Chairman Foxx, would you like to comment?
Well, I agree with you, and I mentioned that when I answered about the Rosa Parks book. I have no idea if that is age appropriate for them, but I agree with you also on which other books, are they age appropriate for children? And again, there is no place in this bill where we talk about banning of books. That is not in here. And I also like to say, you know, my friend Mr. McGovern, he mentioned free society isn't afraid of ideas. Well, we certainly agree with that, but as you point out, it depends on what ideas and whether or not you agree with the ideas. And so I'm very concerned about what I see as a bit of hypocrisy here in terms of whether or not people want this. We're not telling the school boards what to do with the books that they have. We're not telling parents to go complain. We simply want parents to be informed. It then is up to the schools. It's on. It's on. Okay. It's then up to the local schools, and as somebody pointed out, the parents are, we hope, electing the local school board members if the local school board members are honest about what their positions are on different issues. But yes, no, everything has to be age appropriate.
Well, thank you for the clarification, Chairman Foxx. I appreciate it. For the sake of, I've got a lot more, but for the sake of time, I'm going to yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Gentlelady from Pennsylvania is recognized for questions.
Thank you. I would yield a minute to my colleague, the ranking member.
Yeah, the gentlelady wondered whether this book was age appropriate for second grade. On the back, it says level grade 1. So, I mean, this was banned in the second grade. So I just point that out for the record. Thank you.
So I'm kind of surprised and disappointed that our Republican colleagues are forcing a vote on this bill that injects Washington, D.C. politics and national culture wars into our neighborhood schools. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle talk frequently about being the party of small government and local control. They condemn the intrusion of the federal government into local affairs, but the legislation we're considering here today, it's a stunning act of federal overreach that would essentially nationalize our education system, hinder students' ability to learn, and discredit the important work that educators, librarians, and other school professionals, many of whom are local parents, the work that they do every day. It prioritizes right-wing politics over parents, weakens the voices and prerogatives of local community, and effectively gives a noisy minority the opportunity to veto the community judgment. It's a heckler's veto. As my colleague Ranking Member McGovern mentioned, even the conservative Cato Institute has said that H.R. 5 suffers from a fundamental flaw. It's not constitutional. And in seeking to pit parents against school boards, it ignores the fact that most school board members are, in fact, parents. I spent 2 decades as a home and school parent, a classroom volunteer, and a school board member while my children attended public schools. During my time on the board, I worked closely with our community members and had countless conversations with involved parents about how our schools could best serve our children and our taxpayers, where we could do better, and where our options were limited, usually by financial constraints. From that experience, I know how much children do benefit when parents and teachers work together to help children reach their full potential. But it's clear that that's not what this bill is going to do. It doesn't actually facilitate parents, educators, and school districts to work together more effectively. This bill drives wedges between parents and public schools and teachers in a way that hurts students and disregards the good work that our public schools do. When parents in my district talk about our local schools, their primary concerns are about things that we know will help America's kids succeed. Hiring enough teachers, librarians, and guidance counselors. Fixing crumbling school buildings that still have lead paint and asbestos. Preparing young people for the jobs and challenges of the 21st century. Ensuring that our children have access to healthy food. Getting students the support that they need. We should be making sure that our young people have the tools they need to be safe, grow, and learn, not stifle their ideas, threaten their civil rights and those of their parents, or censor their classrooms and teachers, or take books off library shelves, as we've already heard today. Ranking Member Scott, Chairwoman Foxx mentioned that public schools are funded with taxpayer dollars, although in fact, most of those dollars come from our state and local sources. This bill wouldn't provide additional funding to meet the requirements in the bill, would it?
No, as you pointed out, there's no money for school construction, there's no money for teacher salaries, there's no money for new technology, there's no money for after-school programs, there's no money for parent coordinators that would actually advance education.
Yeah, I mean, as I was reading through the bill, and it's mandating how many meetings have to occur, and it's mandating what gets put on the school website, I just think back to all the conversations we had on my school board about how difficult it was to keep up with the unfunded mandates that already existed and to keep things current when those dollars are so precious. I also understand that the Education and Workforce Minority put forward some legislation as an alternative to this that would provide additional support for schools and to both help with parent engagement and prevent some of the things we've been talking about here, including book banning and censorship of history, like Rosa Parks' history. Can you discuss those alternatives a little?
Well, part of, in most schools, trying to get the parents engaged is the challenge. And parent coordinators will increase. We've seen, and I've seen in schools in my district where you have parent coordinators, the participation in the PTA goes way up. Mm-hmm. That's what you need. You want the parents engaged, and there's no funding in the bill for that. You talk about things that are age appropriate. Yes, the librarians are professional, and they will decide what's age appropriate with the parental involvement, but not being subject to a vocal minority or national group trying to come in and threaten the school board with lawsuits. You get professional judgments. The gentleman from Pennsylvania has left. I did want to respond to the fact that he quoted a Democrat who said something during the last governor's campaign. I'm not aware of any Democrat that defended that remark. Mm-hmm. And so if federal legislation needs to be drafted because one member of the opposing party said something that nobody else agreed with, I would certainly, I mean, there are a lot of things that are not, obviously not the majority position of the Republican side, but you can pick out a lot of stuff that said that nobody else agreed with. That is not should not be the stimulus for federal legislation.
Thank you. Well, I think just the back and forth we've had today shows the limits of what politicians in D.C. should be doing in terms of whether they know what's age appropriate or not. And we really, schools are a place where kids and families go to be with their friends, their neighbors, to learn, to be in community. And I think injecting D.C. chaos into our neighborhood schools is a really, really bad idea. With that, I yield back.
Gentlelady from Minnesota is recognized for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I am incredibly confused about the fact that all we're talking about is banning books. Because what the bill is about making sure that parents have a say in their child's education. As a parent, as a grandparent, that is the most important thing. Parents know what's best for their children. They should have influence, they should have an understanding, they should know what's going on in a child's school. And I think COVID showed a lot of parents what was going on. And so I think you see this, they're up in arms, because finally when they were actually exposed to what their children were being taught, what they were being exposed to, they went, oh no, what is going on in our schools? And so if there's some positive things about COVID, that was one of them that they really understood. And so I'm just flabbergasted that there's been so much discussion against a bill that will provide parents with information, transparency, the ability to be involved in their child's education. And so maybe just to redirect a little bit, Mrs. Foxx, could you tell us a little bit about some of the provisions that would allow for transparency and input by the parents into their children's education?
Okay, it's really very simple, Congresswoman Fishback, very simple. Parents have a right to know what's in the curriculum, okay? And they want to know what they're being taught. I mean, to keep my comments succinct, I'm going to tell you, reinforces that parents have the right to be heard. We think that's really important. But the key to this all, as you pointed out, is during COVID, parents found out some of the awful things that were being taught in the schools. And as you said, they said, oh no, this is not acceptable. And we want to make sure parents know what's being taught in the schools. We want the parents to have their privacy of their children kept. We want them to know that the children are safe, and that we want them to know where the money's coming from, how it's being spent. They're really simple concepts in here, and nowhere do we mention the banning of books. Nowhere. So we think they need to know what the books are in the library, and I'm interested in the kind of language, red tape, matrix. You know, our colleagues on the other side of the aisle try to make things so much more complicated when it's a simple piece of legislation. So I was reading, and that we're involved in culture wars. There's nothing about a culture war in this. It's simple transparency and accountability. Two terms you're going to be hearing a lot about, I think, in this session of Congress.
Thank you, Mrs. Foxx, because I think that brought it back to what we are really, truly talking about. We're not, and I don't think it was fair to bring a book, read part of it, and then ask you and demand some kind of, professional opinion on what happened with the book, and there was no context for that. Just right. That it.
Would the gentlewoman yield for a minute?
Ma'am.
Just it was the whole book. You can read it if you
okay.
like.
Thank you. But I think what we are forgetting is the parents, and what we are really forgetting is the children, whose parents want input. Parents are the best, first, and biggest advocates for their children. Right. And that's where we need to lay the responsibility of their education, and their opinions matter. And I think that we've also seen in some of the examples of school boards across the country that they haven't allowed for the input that they should from parents. And so I would just like to advocate for all of those parents out there who want to understand what is going on in their children's schools, want to have input. And I think that this legislation is one step in that direction. And we absolutely have to do it for those kids that are incredibly important to our future, and the parents that are raising them and need to have the input. So thank you, and with that, I yield back.
Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized for questions.
I thank the chairman. I'm going to try and keep this fairly short. The other side of the aisle sound like raging libertarians. They almost made the argument for H.R. 899, which is my bill to end the Federal Department of Education. I appreciate the gentlelady's comments about her experience on the school board and the unfunded mandates that come from the Department of Education. I hear the same thing from my school boards complaining about this. And then I also heard the other side of the aisle already say that Republicans want to create a national school board, that we want to nationalize our school system. Mr. Scott, can you explain how a 30-page bill can take a 4,000-person bureaucracy and morph it into a national school board, or how that nationalizes our school system, how Ms. Fox's 30-page bill could fundamentally change the nature of this?
Well,
I'm sorry, I'm putting you on the spot. I'm asking you to defend.
The federal, I'll just begin with the federal right of action to talk endlessly before the local school board. If you're a school board member, you would question the federal right of action, somebody coming in with an federal injunction requiring the school board to listen to each and every one of 100 people that show up because they have an individual right to endlessly address the school board. I don't think that the federal government ought to be dictating how you address the school board. And every school board gives opportunity for public comment. Most of them have some reasonable limitation, like 3 minutes or 5 minutes, but not endless, and not as a result of a federal cause of action. In terms of the listing every book that you've got in the library up to date to the minute, making that searchable on a national basis, yeah, that subjects every elementary school library to a campaign.
Isn't that just like a a computerized card catalog? I remember when I was in grade school and I went to public school, K through 12, don't libraries pride themselves on having a list of every book and its number, and they teach you how to search that? And it seems to me like they're all computerized at this point, so just making that outwardly facing doesn't seem like it turns what's already a 4,000 bureaucrat agency into a national school board. I want to give Ms. Foxx a chance to talk about that, because that was the accusation from the other side of the aisle, that this bill is evidence that Republicans want a national school board, that we want to nationalize our school system. It looks, and by the way, full disclosure again, I've got a bill, I urge everybody to co-sponsor it, that's concerned about the federal government's overreach. It would end the Department of Education, but I just find it somewhat laughable. Not laughable, I want to laugh at the other side. I find it incredulous to believe that adding 2 or 3 things to the list of things that 4,000 bureaucrats already do is somehow magically going to create a national school board that doesn't already exist in some fashion. So, Ms. Foxx, I'd like for you to have a chance to comment on the other side of the aisle's accusations.
Anybody who's been around me for any period of time would know that I am totally opposed to any more control coming back to the federal government in terms of education. I pick up my copy of the Constitution all the time and point out the word education is not in there as one of our responsibilities. It's not an enumerated power. However, the way I always say it is, we're into education. Again, I wouldn't have had anything to do with that if I'd had control over it, but we're in it. And so, again, the idea now is to make what we have as transparent and accountable as we possibly can. I'm totally opposed to more federal control over education. Right now, as Ms. Scanlon has said, I think she said a small amount of money goes to the schools. Most of it does come from the local and state governments. But we already have tremendous control over the schools through the accretion of the federal bureaucrats taking control and telling schools what to do, issuing guidance, not rules, not going through the regular process. So I am totally opposed to a national school board. And I would never present legislation that would get us anywhere closer to that.
So, I mean, my characterization of this bill from my conservative standpoint, it's one of 435 viewpoints, is that, I don't think this Department of Education at the federal level should exist. I think parents school boards and states should decide the curriculum and how and what teachers teach. But if we aren't going to get rid of this organization, if it's going to exist, the least bad thing it can do is require transparency.
Correct.
And so with that, I have no further comments, and I yield back to Chairman.
Gentleman from Colorado is recognized for questions.
Always tricky there. I thank the chairman and I thank the chairwoman and the ranking member for being here today and to discuss obviously a very important topic. I, like many of the committee members, am a parent. I think as many of you know, have a 4-year-old daughter, and my wife and I are expecting our second child in May. So this is a subject that's very close to my heart, as I suspect it is to many others. I listened to the tail end of my friend Mr. Massey's comments regarding his bill, which I hoped we would discuss today, regarding his proposal to eliminate the Department of Education. And I guess what I would say is I'm a bit confused by some of the dialogue that the gentleman had with the chairwoman. And the reason is, I mean, I'm a passionate supporter of parental engagement and ensuring that parents have the ability, obviously, to be able to guide their children's education. But I have often heard my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, and in reviewing some of the statements made by the chairwoman in the past, of their fears regarding federal involvement in education at the local level. And it seems to me like this bill is strengthening the role of the U.S. Department of Education as it relates to the way in which local school districts back in our respective states are governed, not weakening it. Am I wrong there, Madam Chair, or am I reading that wrong?
The title of the bill is the Parents' Bill of Rights.
Sure.
Just read the title of the bill, and that tells you what we are trying to do. No, we are not trying to strengthen the Department of Education. We are trying to strengthen the role of parents in their ability to understand what's being taught in the schools, where the money that they're paying into the schools is going. So no, the title of the bill is the Parents' Bill of Rights, not how can we strengthen the U.S. Department of Education.
It's interesting you say that, Madam Chair, because as I read this bill, I'm looking at page 27. This is subparagraph H on enforcement and reporting. Perhaps this section has come up previously. Subparagraph C, subparagraph 1, I'll quote, enforcement. The Secretary shall take such action as the Secretary determines appropriate to enforce this section, except that action to terminate assistance provided under an applicable program shall be taken only if the Secretary determines and then lists a number of conditions. So to me, that sounds like you are saying that the Secretary of Education can take whatever action they determine appropriate to be able to enforce the various provisions of this legislation. Am I reading that provision wrong?
That's current law.
This is current, but you're not trying to change it, I guess is what my point. You're saying that in order to enforce this section, these new regulations and rules that you have either are putting in statute or are asking the Secretary of Education to promulgate, that the Secretary will have power to enforce those. Does that mean that the Secretary could, deprive funding for a local school district, tell a school board what to do, shut down?
You and I have two different pages of 27. I'm sorry, I'm looking at the rules print, because I can't find exactly where you are on page 27. I'm on the...
Sure, my apologies if I give you the wrong page number here. I'll make sure we're working off the right.
This is page 20, not page 26.
Oh, it's page 20. Got it.
Page 26?
It is current law. We're adding how the transparency occurs under the existing law.
So I guess
So we're just adding paragraphs.
Yeah, I'm trying to understand how promulgating a new set of requirements and rules that every school district in the United States of America will have to comply with, and enabling the Secretary of Education, whom many of your colleagues, perhaps you bemoan and would like to see eliminated in terms of the role of the Department of Education, giving that secretary unfettered ability to enforce these provisions. How is that not giving the Secretary of Education more power?
Well, it's confined to the very little piece that we're talking about. You're saying giving him unfettered control? I don't think so.
The Secretary shall take action as the Secretary determines appropriate to enforce this section. The only limitation is if he decides that he believes that assistance should be terminated to a particular school district, then the Secretary needs to comply with the various conditions that you've outlined in this statute.
Yeah, it's the current law there, and then we add under that the reporting. Each agency that receives funds shall, without identifying any personal information. This is where we get into the issue of safety of children.
Yeah.
So
I guess what I'm saying, Madam Chair, is
it's pretty well described how we tell this, how the Secretary is told to do this.
I agree. I don't think there's any ambiguity at all as to the Secretary's role. I think it's fairly clear in existing law and in the statute you propose. I'm simply suggesting that in the past, and perhaps the ranking member would care to comment on this or opine on it, the debate within your distinguished committee has been that the Secretary of Education should have less authority, not more. That any opportunity at which a Democratic member has proposed perhaps a new program or a new set of requirements that the Secretary of Education ought to be able to enforce nationwide, the argument, the retort that we've often heard from the other side of the aisle is that the federal government should have no role in enforcing any rules, any regulations as it relates to local school districts. And now it seems to me that you're making the opposite argument. Is that, Mr. Massey?
Yeah, thank you for yielding. I'm glad you distinguished the difference between less authority and no authority, because I would give them no authority, because I see nowhere in the Constitution are they authorized. And you make a great point, but I think what we're talking about is...
I'll go ahead and reclaim my time at that juncture, if that's appreciated. No, I'm kidding. Go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
You want to stop right
Yeah, no, go ahead, Mr.
Right,
Massey.
and strike all the words before it. But, no, I think, what I hear here in this bill is it doesn't give any new enforcement authority. What we're discussing here is what they're going to enforce. And if you're asking me to be intellectually and ideologically consistent, I will be. I would eliminate this department. I was in the 4th grade before it existed and did just fine.
And as you know, Mr. Massey, and I appreciate the colloquy, and I always appreciate your candor. And if anything, I'm only, I suppose, begging of my other colleagues to apply that same intellectual honesty with respect to the current bill that's before us. So
don't worry.
Perhaps Mr. Roy will get to that. I want to yield a moment to the ranking member.
Thank you. Well, part of the problem is you're trying to enforce, there's nothing in here that isn't already going on. They have the right to see documents. Well, they got freedom of information to get documents already. Opportunity to be heard. That's no real power, because what you end up with is the most loudest vocal minority getting their way, and that's how you get slavery is wrong being banned from classrooms.
I mean, that's a great point, ranking member, and maybe perhaps, Madam Chair, you might be able to add something on this front. So I take it you would describe the rights that you are attempting, that you propose to codify in this legislation as vitally important. Is that a fair assessment?
Absolutely. And with all due respect, Mr. Negus, I do think you're off on what you're saying about what's in the enforcement section and what we have added in terms of the privacy information.
I hear you.
I think you're not interpreting it correctly.
Well, I think the colloquy between me and Mr. Massey, I mean, it seemed like, I don't want to speak for Mr. Massey, but he agreed with my interpretation of it as well. I'm not saying ideologically, but in any event, we'll move past that. I guess the point the question I'm asking now really relates to some of the rights that you have put within this bill, or that you specified or described, right? So an example would be the right to information about any plans to eliminate gifted and talented programs in the child's school, right? That's an important right. I assume you'd agree.
Well, you're suggesting you don't already have it.
Well, no, I'm asking, Madam Chair, if that's an important right.
Absolutely.
And the right-
Parents should know
I
what
agree.
is being, because if it's going to affect their child.
Yes, Madam Chair, I
they
agree
need
with
to
you.
know.
And I agree with you.
Okay.
That's just what I'm saying. It's not a trick question. The right to review any professional development materials. I think that's a really important right, too. I assume you agree.
Agree.
Okay, so here's my question. What county is I know you have multiple districts, multiple counties within your congressional district. What's the largest county in your congressional district?
The largest county in my
Yes,
district?
yes, ma'am.
I assume it's Forsyth County Forsyth County is the largest county.
And I have not had the pleasure of visiting Forsyth County. Is that county, does it have a particular school district in that county, or does it extend beyond?
No, it's one county system.
It's one county system. Does that county system provide that school district with parents the right to information, this subparagraph I, about any plans to eliminate gifted and talented programs in the child's school?
You know, I've not read the policy of the Forsyth County Schools.
Of the largest school district in your district?
Well, I haven't read their policy manual, and I don't think it's typical that a member would read the policy manuals of every one of their school boards. Maybe the ranking member's done that, but frankly, I haven't had a chance to do that. I was on a school board for 12 years, and I helped write the first policy manual that the school board put in place. But I haven't read the policy manual for Forsyth County.
I would just suggest, because I think it underscores the larger debate that we're having about local control and the role of the federal government, that the best place to start, because I agree with you, these are really important, vital rights that every parent in the country ought to have. And hold on, if I may, Madam Chair, and I would think the best place to start would be with your local school board, would be to ask the local school board and make sure that the right to review, for example, any professional development materials is secured. And it just strikes me as odd, if that right is as important as you and I both agree it is, that the largest school district in your district, that at least as of right now, we're unclear as to whether or not that right is something that school district has. So I don't, if the ranking member would care to make a final comment.
That's the point. I can't imagine, and you have a right to address the school board. How many school boards do you know where you don't routinely have the right, within reason, to address the school board? Now, if you want to make a 20-minute presentation at every meeting, they may limit your right to speak. But, I mean, you list it as a right. That's what the Cato Institute said, even if it were constitutional, and they don't believe it is, it would not give parents any real power. They just list things that are nice that are already going on. And once you have the right to see the documents, then what? The vocal minority gets to decide what's taught?
Well, I thank the ranking member. I thank the chairwoman. Again, I thank both members here today for their testimony and for the conversation, the discussion. To the
And
extent
Mr.
that my
Chairman, if I might add a comment here.
Sure.
Again, it's not a matter of what the school districts in my district have in their policy manual. It's a matter of all parents in this country having the right. Again, I've not read the policy manual. I think, frankly, that our school systems in the 5th District of North Carolina do a pretty good job of engaging parents and parents being engaged in the schools. So I really don't have much of an argument, but I do know, and I can give some examples of places in this country where parents are not allowed to speak at school board meetings, where parents have been arrested for speaking at school board meetings, for exercising their constitutional rights to petition their government, which are already in the Constitution, in the First Amendment. So what we're trying to do is make it really, really clear to the American public that parents have rights when it comes to their children's education.
And Madam Chair,
I think that's very important.
and Madam Chair, I would simply say that and I don't want to get an extended debate with you on this topic, but I would just to reiterate what I had mentioned before, the point of me raising your particular school district is my sense that, again, in a country that very much values, prizes local control, and I know my colleagues and Mr. Roy and others, I don't want to speak for him, but I suspect will touch on this, certainly agree that a good place to start as we debate the codification within this potential proposed piece of legislation around various rights that a parent would have vis-a-vis their school district would be in our local communities to check to see, what's been promulgated and regulated at the local level, and then follow that and emulate that. So to the extent that it's working effectively and is broadly based. So in any event.
Just very briefly.
Sure, Ranking Member.
There's a provision in the bill that says that if you're exercising your right to speak, you should not be criminalized. And an amendment was accepted to point out, but if there's a credible threat of violence, then of course, public safety officials should be called. And that amendment was adopted.
So in any event, I would just again say I agree with the various rights that were in that we were sort of going back through with me and the chairwoman, and I appreciate the debate today. But I would hope that we also would bring some sense of our local communities to this discussion, and that's the reasoning for my exchange. With that, I yield back to the chair.
Gentleman from South Carolina is recognized for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank both of you for appearing today. I'm not going to belabor this. Ms. Foxx, Dr. Foxx, you were a school board member for 12 years. You taught school. You were president of a junior college, I think, in North Carolina. So this topic is not something that you don't know anything about. You experienced it in the classroom. You see it, you feel it, you know it. Is that right? This bill, I read over it, I said, this should be called the Transparency Bill of Rights. And when you look over, what is you're spelling out, parents should have the right to know what the children are being taught. I've got 17 grandchildren, 4 children, and it would shock you to see the books. And Mr. McGovern pulled one book, which happened to be a good book. I can pull you 20 books that are not appropriate, not only for the age, but not appropriate to educate that child for competition in the 21st century and for anything, the sex books that are out there. So this is just a transparency rights. This sets out a standard that they know that should have been followed anyway, but they're not. Now, a lot of this has been brought on by this administration, and particularly the Attorney General on October 4th, his memorandum to directors all across the Department of Justice, basically informing them that they've got the intent to undergo a series of measures designed to address the rise in criminal conduct directed toward school personnel. On October 20th, he got an overwhelming number of replies across judicial districts, and they're saying there's been no threat of violence. Now, this is an Attorney General who is not interested in the protection of Supreme Court justice. He's not interested in prosecuting those who are tearing our cities up, but he targeted school boards. That's where a lot of this is coming from now, particularly that you're spelling out. And I guess my question to you is, I don't know where we got to where we are, where 90% of students in recent surveys have been taught critical race theory. How is that going to enable somebody to compete in the 21st century, and how is that skill related? Is that part of our education system? They had public school district took middle schoolers to a drag show without telling their parents. This is a transparency bill. There's no, it should have been implemented anyway. I agree with Thomas, the thing's gotten so out of line. The Department of Education should be abolished anyway. It's an overreach of government. It's not in the Constitution. But I appreciate you putting this up. I think it makes sense, and it shouldn't be something that we've had to debate and spend, we've spent 3 hours now. But thanks for putting it up, and I have no further questions.
Thank you, and thank you for emphasizing again that this is a bill about transparency and accountability. As I said, 2 words we're going to hear a lot of during this session of Congress.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for questions.
I thank the chairman. I thank the witnesses. I would like to note that there's been a significant amount of conversation about a book, quote, banned in Florida, in Duval County. Now, I'm not an expert on the subject because I don't live there, but my understanding is that that book is on the shelf. The book in question about Rosa Parks, the book in question about Roberto Clemente that was raised and so forth, that those books are on the shelf after a review process that they went through, having pulled certain books based on certain questions raised, and that those books are back on the shelf. And in fact, the commissioner, the Florida Commissioner of Education, I don't know if that's the exact title, has actually promoted that Roberto Clemente book that was in question as a commissioner's book and book of note. My point being, there was a process for trying to identify books that raised questions. That's what the legislature in Florida put forward on behalf of parents, saying there are books in schools that parents have concerns about. Now, what would some of those books potentially be? Just hypothetically speaking in Florida. How about Genderqueer, a memoir, an explicit pornographic book showing sex acts? We good with that? Are we? Are we good with that? Now, maybe that's not a federal issue. I'll get to that in a minute. How about Flamer, a graphic book about young boys performing sexual acts at a summer camp? Man, would I love my 13-year-old boy to walk into a library and find that on the bookshelf. How about This Book is Gay, a book containing instructions on the ins and outs of gay sex? Now, these are books that were removed in Florida because the legislature took action, and then the various school agencies had to make decisions at the local level and have to go through and pull books and look at them. Now, some of the books that were raised were books involving race. Yes, that is true. And so books about heroes like Rosa Parks and Roberto Clemente. And I'd rather sit here and talk about Roberto Clemente finishing his career sitting right on 3,000 hits and then sadly but heroically dying in a plane crash off the coast of Puerto Rico, taking goods and services to help his fellow mankind as the hero that Roberto Clemente was and that I was raised to believe him to be. And that Rosa Parks was the hero that she was in telling people to go kiss her rear end and pound sand. She wasn't going to sit in the back of the bus. One of the greatest heroes in American history. But there were questions being raised about certain books, and race was part of that. And I would note in this conversation and about this issue of the books going back, I found this to be compelling, that the son of Roberto Clemente Jr., said he owns the book in question, reread the book, said his story is his story. He went through racism. It's something that can't be changed, Clemente Jr. said. But obviously, for the younger students, if it's something that they being school boards and parents, feel is too much for them, they might be able to utilize a different book with the same story, but it's framed differently for them for that age group. Now, I don't know. I have not read the book, okay? I love Roberto Clemente, and my son has read numerous books on Roberto Clemente. But I don't know what's in the book, and I don't know the questions involved about exposing the questions of race to our children. Because in a different story, Roberto Clemente Jr. pointed out, and I don't want to speak for him, I don't want to draw him into this political mess, but he made a point of saying something in the zip code of, if one seeks to have a colorblind society and raise your children that way, then when does one insert issues of racism into the education stream of our children? That is a very reasonable question. Do you do that at kindergarten, second grade, fifth grade, ninth grade? Look, by 11th grade AP history, I was going to Gettysburg and reenacting Pickett's Charge in my 11th grade AP history class. I was going to reenact John Brown's raid in Harper's Ferry over across the mountain from where I grew up in Virginia. Right? I was living and understanding American history in the context of that as an 11th grader, taught by my very liberal 11th grade AP history teacher, whom I loved. That's appropriate. Now, when do you talk about that? I don't know. But that is a conversation between parents and teachers and school boards and, yes, the state legislature. And so in Florida, they passed a law saying we don't want certain things. They acted, they pulled some books, and they put a lot of them back, including, I am told, the Rosa Parks book, as they probably should have, not having read the book. This is actually important to this conversation because we're taking something that is the Republican Party here, and I'll get to federalism in a minute, trying to say something pretty simple. Parents should have rights when it comes to raising their children. And that is not a debatable subject. Let me be perfectly clear. It is not debatable. Parents have rights when it comes to how their children are raised. Now, how that's enforced and how you protect them and where you protect them, that's a bit debatable. Parents have the right to know what's being taught. Parents have the right to be heard. Parents have the right to see the school budget and spending. Parents have the right to protect their child's privacy. Parents have the right to be updated on violent activity in their school. Does the gentlelady think any of that is particularly controversial? Let's set aside federalism issues for a minute. Does the gentlelady find any of those rights to be recognized among parents in terms of transparency and the list I just raised at a very high level to be particularly controversial or problematic?
No, but you said the rights of parents are not debatable, but I believe we've heard some expressions here today that would call that into question, because I do think there are people on the other side of the aisle who believe that. Terry McAuliffe said that. John Yarmouth said that once in one of our committee meetings, that the schools have to protect children against their parents at times. That was said by a Democrat in one of our education meetings. And so I do think there are some people who question whether parents have the right to be in charge of their children's education.
I think the gentlelady is correct, and I know we have a lot to get through, but I would just note that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are raising questions about what a school district in a state did and trying to connect that, by the way, not accurately reflecting the end result of that process or the full context of what occurred in that particular instance in Florida, as I just laid out. To then say that a bill here to lay out rights for parents is somehow going to lead to book bans, right? To have parents be able to know what the book is in question that is being put in the library, the books that I've read before, right? That somehow, that if I have the right to know as a parent that the book Flamer, a graphic book about young boys performing sexual acts at a summer camp, that my right to know that that book exists in the school, in the library, somehow that's going to result in immediate book bans. Well, yes, it might result in that book being removed from the library, as it should. But it will be debated where it should be, there, among parents and among school board members and among educators in the community, because now those parents had the right to know what was being put in front of their kids. Would the gentlelady agree?
I agree, and I think Mr. McGovern said the Rosa Parks book has been banned. I question what that means and what that meant at the time, but it's obvious from what you've said, the book has not been banned from that school system.
What I'm telling you is my understanding, and what I've been told in Florida is that they have returned or in the process of returning after a review process of books, including the books that I just read, the books that were in question. These books that are highly suspect, Genderqueer, a memoir, This Book is Gay, a book containing instructions on the ins and outs of gay sex, that there were books removed, and then there were books that were pulled back, reviewed, and then have been restored and put back. I don't know for sure every book in question, but I do know that, for example, the commissioner in Florida has put out the Roberto Clemente book as a book that is a great book and should be read and so forth.
Yeah, you actually just reminded me of something that occurred, I'm pretty sure, when I was in college, that there were certain books in the library when I was in college that were not on the shelf of the library, but that one had to go to the librarian to get them out. I'm going to do a little investigation of that because now my memory is a little unclear about it, but I'm pretty sure that happened to college students many, many years ago at my college.
And the next point that
Would the gentleman
I would
yield-
make is, briefly,
Yeah, no, I just want to ask unanimous consent to insert into a record an article that appeared on December 22nd about, because I've been absent, but I've heard you said that this book wasn't removed from the school, wasn't banned from
I did not say that. I said that the book was pulled back for review and that I am told it's been put back on the shelf.
Well, according to this article, that's not the case, but nonetheless, pulling a book like this for review, I mean, that's one of the problems with this underlying bill.
Okay, we're
I ask
claiming
unanimous
my
consent to
time
insert
because
this
we're
into
claiming
the
my
record.
time because the gentleman wasn't here to hear what I said.
Without
Put it in
objection.
context when I was quoting Roberto Clemente Jr. about the issue of race and how if one were to desire to teach children that a colorblind society is preferred, that when you begin teaching about racism and race is a question. Do you do that when they're 3, 5, 10? When do you do that? When do you have a full-blown conversation about the issues of race with a child, depending on how you want to raise them and what your values are in terms of raising a child?
I would hope your values are such that at the earliest age possible, you would tell your child that discrimination is wrong and intolerable, that your child should respect.
But reclaiming my time, the extent to which and how I wish to teach my child about race might be more about teaching people that everybody should be treated equally and not view people through the lens of race, if that is the actual goal and desire of society. But the debate is among parents. The debate should be among parents and school boards. And the only issue that's being raised in this bill is what right parents have to know what is being taught. I noticed that you're not racing to defend the books that I rattled off about Flamer or gender, whatever these books are about gay sex being taught to our kids at oral sex acts at summer camps. Are we going to defend those books that were removed from libraries? Were those particularly advantageous for the well-being of educating our youth? When report after report in the wake of the shutdown of our schools is demonstrating that our children are now years behind in education proficiency. I would note finally for the gentlelady that much has been made about this being highly violative of federalism principles. Now, I will acknowledge it's not my favorite course of action to have the federal government step in and say, you, local board, shall do X. But I would note, and I'm going to ask the gentlelady this, to the point of the gentleman from Kentucky, that this institution is a little pregnant in how we use the spending power, I think unconstitutionally, by the way, the spending power to demand of all of our local governments that they conform. Would the gentlelady agree that we do that on countless ways and countless bases?
Yes, sir.
And would the gentlelady agree that there are countless provisions in existing law in this exact form for schools that they must follow that include, for example, parents' right to know? Is there not a section already in the code called Parents' Right to Know?
Yes.
And does that parents' right to know section contain requirements that the parents must know, for example, the qualifications of a teacher and be able to get access to the qualifications of a teacher?
Yes.
So is that not already the federal government inserting itself into the local schools and saying that we are going to demand that if you're going to take these federal dollars, you must have the ability and you must provide for parents that right to know?
And by the way, parents get pretty concerned about that sometimes when they find out their child is in a classroom for almost a year with a parent who's not certified, with a teacher who's not certified in that area. And it has caused consternation on the part of parents, as it should, when the local schools are promising that the children will be in the classroom of a certified teacher.
And would the gentlelady also agree that there are numerous requirements in the current code, and I won't go through them all, whether it's the parent's right to know we just talked about, or whether it's assurances from agencies about who's going to be able to get access to schools, including, for example, migrants and so forth, that there's a long list of things that are put as requirements to local school agencies by the federal government under current law.
That was the point I was making earlier.
Right.
Approximately 7% of the money in the local schools comes from the federal government. And I've often perhaps used a little hyperbole, but said about 95% of the rules and regulations are coming from the federal government.
So I would just close with this by saying, while I completely share and co-sponsor the legislation from the gentleman from Kentucky that we should abolish the Department of Education and get out of the business altogether, and while I certainly do not generally like to go down the road that this bill goes down, respectfully, with respect to more requirements on local schools, the reality here is that we are, as I said before, more than pregnant in this regard. And to just simply say that parents have a right to understand what their kids are being taught hardly seems an enormous addition to the already litany of things that are being required among those local school districts. And I would also then invite my colleagues on the other side of the aisle that if they are as frustrated as I of the extent to which the federal government interferes with local schools, that they can vote for my amendment, which would block grant the dollars to the states and get out of the business altogether. And I'll be offering that amendment and voting for that amendment. I understand some of my colleagues may not because it might frustrate the purpose of this amendment. I get it. But I will be offering that amendment to say all the dollars, strike it, take these ESCA dollars, Title I, and boom, give them to the states. So if we don't like the way they meddle, give it to the states. But that's not going to pass. And so the point here is Republicans are offering an extension here of existing requirements to give rights to parents. Last thing I would say is I'll also be offering an amendment that says that dollars should follow the child. Again, we should get back to the basics here and allow parents to take care of their own children. I yield back.
The gentlelady from Indiana is recognized for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you,
And a
Dr.
member of the committee.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Foxx and Ranking Member Scott for coming to testify before us today. I appreciate your time. I am a member of the Education and Workforce Committee, so I'm glad this is being considered by the committee. I think it's so important. Dr. Foxx, there's been some discussion on the appropriate role of the federal government in education with respect to this legislation. Does this bill, in your opinion, open the door to the federal government getting too involved in education?
No, and I thank Mr. Roy for his comments. And I think he amplifies the fact that the federal government is already involved. Many of us think inappropriately, and I will state that again, but it doesn't open the door for the federal government to micromanage the schools. It adds some things, which again, will go back to what happened during COVID. Parents found out that they were not being adequately informed of what was happening in the schools. And as the first teachers of their children, and as the people who should be most concerned about the welfare of their children, they need to know what's being taught in the schools, what's happening in the schools as far as crimes concerned, what's happening with their children's privacy information, where the money's, their hardworking taxpayers' dollars are being spent. So we think this is an appropriate addition to the kinds of things that parents ought to be told, and that we want children to be safe in the schools.
Yes, thank you. I agree. We've heard some comments from our colleagues across the aisle that we're forcing schools to out students. We're not forcing schools to out students. We are, though, solidifying parental rights to know what is happening with their own children. I want to just note that sending a child to a public school does not terminate their own parental rights at the door.
Correct.
That's what my colleagues across the aisle, I think, seem to believe. Dr. Foxx, with the Parents' Bill of Rights, aren't we simply reaffirming the rightful place of parents in the driver's seat with regard to their children's education and well-being?
Yes, absolutely. And I think we've done a very good job in this bill of really honing down the issues. to those things that we think, as Republicans, are the most important things for parents to know about what's happening in the schools. So we're doing our best not to add any burdens to the schools, not to push down a lot of unfunded mandates to the schools. So I think, yeah, I think we're being very judicious in what we do because, again, the majority of us, I believe, would like to get the federal government out of the education business altogether. And so while I have a great deal of respect for the Cato Institute, I wonder if Cato came out against ESEA
Right.
when ESEA was passed. I don't know that it did, maybe it did, or ESSA, when No Child Left Behind was undone and ESSA was passed. I just wonder if Cato came out against that. I don't know.
And I just want to reiterate, the Parents' Bill of Rights contains 5 basic principles. The right that parents have the right to know what their children are being taught, that parents have a right to be heard, that parents have a right to see the school budget, that parents have the right to protect their children's privacy, that parents have a right to keep their children safe. Is there anything in there about book banning?
No, ma'am.
So we've heard also our colleagues across the aisle say that Democrats are partners with parents and that they offered 25 amendments, which I was in committee. We were in committee, Dr. Foxx, until about 3:30, 2:30 in the morning,
Right.
Hearing the amendments. But my view of over and over again, what I heard in amendment after amendment, was that the Democrats want bureaucrats to be in control of children's education and their mental well-being. It was clear to me that what they think is that it's Big Brother that knows best, not mother, father, or guardian. I worked in child services. I've cared for children in foster care. Having the state in place of parents is not the ideal. It is sometimes necessary for the safety of children. However, even in that case, even in the case when foster parents are caring for children who are in the custody of the state, they cannot give children a haircut without getting permission from the child's biological parents. But in the view of Democrats, they want to be able to decide what's best for a child's education and their mental health and well-being, and want to claim the right to keep that information from parents. This very attitude among the liberal elite left is what brought parents to school boards and state houses all across the United States, and yes, even to the Congress, to plead for information, to plead for the safety of their kids in public restrooms and locker rooms, to plead for a quality education, and to plead for anyone who would listen to help restore their parental rights. A word carefully chosen by my friends across the aisle is that they are for parental engagement. That's an interesting word choice. We are for parental rights. They are for parental engagement. But make no mistake, under the engagement model, when push comes to shove and a school must decide between what a parent wants and what is best for the bureaucracy, many have shown time and again they will side with the bureaucracy. And that alone, I think, is a great reason to support this bill to establish the fundamental rights of parents to information and control of their kids' education. Ranking Member Scott, you commented that one of the amendments put forth was for a parent-teacher coordinator. Mr. Scott, who would pay for the salary of the parent and teacher coordinator?
That would be, if we're going to require it, we need to pay for it.
Would the local school corporation be in charge of hiring that person?
Yes.
So how could parents be assured that a parent-teacher coordinator hired by the school corporation would advocate on their behalf?
Well, that's the job of the person. And if you have the right to information, you suggested there's a right to control the education. There's nothing in this bill that requires, after you know the information, there's nothing in this bill that requires the school board to do what the parents are saying they want done.
I would just argue that it would be hard for an employee of the school corporation to be an unimpartial advocate for the parent in that situation. One of the things that you commented is that these things that we're doing, they're either present law or at least general practice. What do you say to parents where this isn't general practice?
Well, I think the right to address the school board without limitation would be one. I'm not aware of any school board where you can't address the school board with reasonable limitations. And you're giving a federal cause of action for someone or group of people, each and every one, having a federal right to tie up a school board meeting without limitation, because the legislative intent was clear when you defeated my amendment to have reasonable limitations on it. There are no reasonable limitations, so what happens after the first 50 out of 100 people have spoken? Do the other 50 have a federal cause of action against the school board?
Mr. Scott, I believe that if 100 parents show up to a school board meeting, they have a right to be heard. So you also said that no law denies.
Without limitation.
No law denies a parent to meet with a school corporation, that documents are public, subject to a FOIA, that we have that opportunity to get curriculum if they file a FOIA. Are you aware that in December of 2022, a judge in the state of Michigan ruled that teachers are exempt from FOIA?
No, but public documents are in Virginia. I'm not familiar with
So
the
there's
law
at least
somewhere
one
else.
state that has determined that a FOIA is not a reasonable request from a parent for information.
Well, I'm
A
not
parent
sure-
had
I'm not
asked
sure
for
what- I'm
lesson
not sure-
plans.
I'm not
Excuse
sure
me, I'm
what-
reclaiming my time.
I'm not sure what they asked for.
A parent had asked for lesson plans, assignments, and other teaching materials from an ethnic and gender studies class. She was provided only with a syllabus. She sued, and the court ruled against her on the basis that teachers in the state of Michigan are exempt from FOIA requests. Are you familiar with the name Nicole Solis?
Excuse me?
Nicole Solis?
No.
Ms. Solis tried to get information from her child's elementary school after a principal informed her they didn't refer to students as boys or girls. She requested information on whether or not her daughter's curriculum included principles of CRT, then expanded her request to include requests in emails from school administrators, teachers, and teachers' unions officials. Guess what she got for following the FOIA procedure? She didn't get the information she was seeking. She got sued by the National Education Association. That lawsuit is still ongoing. So I think these things alone are enough to support this bill. Mr. Scott, if parents shouldn't be in charge of children's education, who should be?
Well, there's nothing in the bill that puts the parents in charge of the education. They have a right to be heard, but that doesn't give them any right in this bill to control the education.
Let me just restate. They have a right to know what their children are being taught. They have a right to be heard. They have a right to see the school budget. They have a right to protect their privacy. They have a right to keep their children safe. I think those are pretty critical to put them in the driver's seat in their kids' education. I'm going to reclaim my time. So the bottom line is parents have a right to be informed. We want limited government with the power to the people. I don't think anything that we're doing in this legislation takes away from limited government. They want limits to the rights of the people through the power of the government. Dr. Foxx, why is it so important to pass this bill?
Well, for all the reasons you have stated, but I wanted that. In charge of their child's education, because then they know what's happening. Up until now, they don't know what's happening.
That's right.
And as you said about Ms. Solis, she was harassed when she was asked for that information. And as you pointed out, she's currently being sued. She was told to get the information, she was going to have to pay. She was going to have to wait. That would deny her the opportunity to be in control of her child's education. And that's what bureaucrats do. They deny the parents the opportunity to be in control of their children's education. And we have many, many examples, as you pointed out. I think Ms. Solis is one of the prime examples of how the bureaucracy fights against parents. And that's why we need this legislation.
I absolutely agree. Mr. Chairman, can I yield 1 minute to Mr. Norman?
Gentleman from South Carolina is recognized.
Aaron, you mentioned something about the safety of children. I just got this early this morning. I live in a small town, Rock Hill, South Carolina. There was a school that was letting males and go into females' bathrooms. They were using Title IX as an excuse. The parents did not know this. And if you're talking about the safety of a child, we've already had an example of a rape in Virginia, I think. This, we're going to take action on. What are they threatening? If we question them, basically they're going to sue us. Guess what we're going to do? We're going to make them sue us if that's what they want to do. We'll countersue. But this is a perfect example just today that we had. And it's insane. I yield back.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman?
Gentleman?
Yeah, apparently the ranking member doesn't have the right to answer questions in the Rules Committee, and I would just urge my colleagues that if questions are being posed, that out of respect that we allow the ranking member to be able to respond. And I just think that's a matter of courtesy. So I point that out just for the record.
Gentleman from New York is recognized for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And to start off, Dr. Foxx, is there anything else that you'd like to add before we conclude?
No, I think you all are very well informed about this. I think, all agree that we don't want the federal government to be involved in education. However, we are. Therefore, we're going to do the best with what we have on our plate until Mr. Massey's amendment passes at some point, or until we can do something about it. I do think this is all about parents and students. It's been brought up a couple of times that students are at the heart of this. Students are not able to make decisions for themselves. In many cases, they're not mature enough, and so we have to leave it up to the parents. So it's we want this, the rights here, it probably should be called Parents and Students Bill of Rights, but to simplify it, we're calling it the Parents' Bill of Rights, because we need the adults to be having the information and making the decisions on behalf of the children.
Thank
So
you.
I'm not sure that was stated clearly enough.
Well, thank you, Dr. Foxx, and thank you, Ranking Member. I don't want to take much more time here, but just to reiterate what my colleagues have said here, and remind my friends across the aisle that there is nothing malevolent about parents knowing about or being involved in their children's classrooms, or to ask questions about what's being taught in their children's classrooms. And there's nothing wrong with empowering parents so that they have a voice in their children's education. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the chairwoman, the ranking member for coming today and their testimony, and both of you are excused.
Thank you all.
Okay, next I would call up, we have a number of members that wish to talk to their amendment, so I would ask Mr. McCormick, Mr. Self, and Mr. Frost to come to the table, please.
And Mr. Chairman, while they're coming, can I ask unanimous consent to insert into the record a statement from Representative Correa on his amendment to H.R. 5? And I ask unanimous consent to insert into the record a statement from Representative Grijalva on his amendment to H.R. 5, which prohibit the bill from being construed as allowing the banning or censorship of books in public elementary or public secondary schools. I'm proud to be a co-sponsor of this amendment. I urge it to be made in order.
Without objection. Gentlemen, whatever chair, fine. And do we need additional chair, I believe? Yeah. Hang on one second. Okay, Mr. McCormick, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate you hearing me out. As a father of 7 and as a educator for 4 years, both in private and public settings, I wanted to point out, I wish everybody was here because I remember somebody saying, talking about local control versus federal control, and I just wanted to point out for the record that we're not just guaranteed local control in our Constitution, but individual rights, even when it's inconvenient for the local government, because ultimate minority is the individual. With that, I have 2 amendments that I wanted to just make my case for. One was just a simple one that allows parents, when there is something that's been violated in this bill, to actually be heard by the board. I think that's, some people say, oh, well, that's never denied. That's just not true. I saw it in my own district in Gwinnett County, where parents literally were denied the opportunity to come before a board and just say, hey, we have a concern. They were denied the opportunity. I think that's a right of every parent to express to the governing body that they've elected. It's a constitutional right to be able to, as Ms. Foxx pointed out so aptly earlier, that is our ability to of the First Amendment to protest our government. The second one, of course, is just that this gives a little bit of teeth to what we're trying to accomplish here. If we are going to give a parental Bill of Rights, we have to have the ability for informed parents to be able to allow their kids not to go to something if it's extracurricular. It has nothing to do with SAT scores or their accomplishment in academics. It has nothing to do with their ability to succeed in life even, but it has to do with the way that we're basically influencing our children, whether they be conservative or liberal. It doesn't really matter. I'm not trying to make a case for a partisan participation. I'm actually just doing quite the opposite, that we as parents have control over what our schools may try to use to weaponize education, to indoctrinate our children, whether it be in a conservative or a liberal agenda. And so those are the two amendments I wanted to have you consider in this bill.
There's no objection. I'm going to allow all the members to testify, and then members can ask whatever questions. Mr. Self, you're recognized to explain your amendment.
Of course. Well, thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to everybody. The First Amendment of the Constitution of the United States protects our right to free speech. As someone who used to work at the American Civil Liberties Union for a number of years, this is something that's really important to me, the freedoms and liberties of our people. Because of the First Amendment, each one of us in this room are allowed to state our opinions, disagreements, and none of us will be punished by our government for it. This is the way it works in this country. This is one of the things that make America a great place. And I thought Republicans, Democrats, and independents all agreed that this is a right that we must appreciate and protect. And yet, in my state of Florida, the Republican Party has thrown away any respect for free speech in the Constitution. Working to terrorize the trans community has really taken priority in my state of Florida. These lawmakers are moving forward a bill where the state can seize custody of children if the child is, quote, at risk of receiving gender-affirming care, with no fine definition of what at risk really means. So a parent in America would have to watch their words, because if the wrong person hears them say something like, I respect my transgendered child's decision about their health care, the state could seize their child, take away their child. And so this is a state wanting, essentially, to kidnap children, to penalize parents for what they believe in and what they say. I believe it is a massive violation of parents' First Amendment rights. And if you truly support parents' rights, you'll support my amendment to reinforce that every parent has a First Amendment right to express support for their student accessing best practice medical care. I can't wait for the day when I get to appear before you and just celebrate the transgender community and the LGBTQ plus community for their creativity, sense of community, beauty, and contributions to society. I could take more than my allotted time to speak on that alone, but for now I'm here to advocate for the bare minimum, the First Amendment rights of parents to support their children, for the freedom and liberty we all deserve as citizens of this country, and for parents everywhere. I urge support for my amendment.
Mr. Frost, you're recognized to explain your amendment.
That was Mr. Frost.
Excuse me, Mr. Self, you're recognized to explain your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm actually here to speak on Mr. Massey's amendment. I withdrew mine in support of his. So just down the hallway here, we've got one of the most famous paintings in America, the U.S. Constitution. I come today to say that the Education Department as a whole is cut from whole cloth, unaided by the U.S. Constitution. I've heard a lot of words since I've just come in just a few minutes about how everyone wants limited government, but then this bill does right the opposite. The governor of Virginia probably owes his election to parents rising up. I believe that to be true. Who used to go to school board meetings? Nobody. Well, a few. Who goes to school board meetings now? They actually have to have security. They actually have to have dramatic security today because the parents are rising up. What failures are we covering with federal dollars? How are we stymieing school choice, which benefits our minority communities the most, with federal dollars? It may only be 7%. I thought it was 8%. The chairwoman said 7%. I recommend we that we support Mr. Massey's amendment. We defund the Department of Education, return the Constitution, and return it to the people, because when they rise up, they act. Why are there no U-Haul trailers in California today, and we have a surplus in Texas? Why does it cost you 1/10 the amount to rent a U-Haul in Texas that it does in California? Now, I'm not sure. I always ask Californians, are you coming as missionaries or as refugees? And I hope they're refugees. but I support Mr. Massey's amendment, and I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Mr. Landsman, you're recognized if you move the mic over, so that would, you bet. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Ranking Member, members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to come and offer 3 amendments. I do so as a former school teacher, spent time in a classroom. My parents were teachers. It's a big part of who I am, and my wife and I now have 2 young kids in public schools. Our son Elijah is a 5th grader. Our daughter Maddie is a 7th grader. So this is the life that we live. This is front and center, and there are 3 amendments to this bill that I'll be offering, and I'll talk about each. The first has to do with liability protection, ensuring that what may be well-intentioned does not lead to a ton of litigation throughout the country, where school districts, schools, and even teachers are being pulled into unnecessary, extremely costly litigation. And so the First Amendment offers a litigation protection, limits the kind of legal issues that schools and teachers would face, because they will come if they miss one book, if they forget to publish one aspect of the material that they're teaching. They will find themselves, not because of ideology, just because somebody wants to make a lot of money. And so I believe the amendment to protect our schools and our teachers, the districts from unnecessary, very costly litigation is very important. The second, as a teacher, as a former teacher and a parent now, the communication between teachers and parents is huge. And I believe that's where we get most of our power, is the ability to communicate effectively with our teachers. And some schools have the resources to do so, and some schools don't. And I think that's a really important opportunity for us. So the Second Amendment would authorize a funding for the kind of technology and support that schools need to ensure that communication between teachers and parents happens across the board, no matter what the school district is, whether they have a ton of money or not. We use a system called Power School. We can email our teachers. It's super easy. Not everyone has that kind of support. And then the third, because like almost all of the Republicans and Democrats, independents in my district, we are fierce believers in local control when it comes to education. So I have been involved in our school district and our board meetings many, many times. It's such an important role that we play. And so the Third Amendment would allow school districts, based on this idea of local control, to opt out of the legislation. And so I'm hoping that you will consider and support all 3 and allow them to be put forward for a vote. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Massey, the ranking member was kind enough to point out, obviously, somebody's spoken on your amendment. Would you like to speak on it yourself?
I don't need to be recognized because Mr. Self spoke more eloquently on my amendment than I ever could. I may have some questions later. Thank you.
God bless you. Are there any questions? I'll start, obviously, with the ranking member for any members of our panel.
No, let me just say to Mr. Landsman and Mr. Frost, I fully support your amendments. Thank you for bringing them here today. I think there were, how many Democratic amendments? There were a lot of Democratic amendments that have been proposed, and I hope that they will be made in order. But, Mr. Self, just to show my good faith, I disagree with Mr. Massey's amendment very, very strongly. But I would vote to make it an order if he decides to offer it as an amendment, because I really believe on something like this, we ought to, I mean, people have obviously strong opinions. We ought to be able to bring them to the floor and have them debated. So
I might want to withdraw it if you're going to.
Well, I'm going to do for you what I hope that you would.
What you didn't do when you were chair?
Which you didn't do for me. And by the way, to the members of the Republicans and the Rules Committee who were on the committee when I was there, I think we were pretty generous to the members of this committee. Mr. Burgess, I hope you're not going to complain, because we made a ton of your amendments in order. Most of them were lousy, but anyway, we made them in order. Anyway.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yeah.
You made them in order, then you unblocked them and voted them down on the floor. So it wasn't really a fair fight.
Yeah. But I will, you know, if we can get a decent amount of Democratic members in order, I will absolutely support making Mr. Massey's amendment in order, because clearly, you know, there is strong feelings about it. But with that, I yield back my time.
Are there any other members that might have questions they wish to address to any members of our panel? Gentlelady from Pennsylvania is recognized.
I just wanted to thank you for bringing the teacher perspective, and I wanted to thank Mr. Frost for speaking out on behalf of families with transgender children, because those kids are under such attack right now in our country, and I think we need to do everything we can to support them and their families. So thank you for that amendment.
I've got a question.
Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Self, isn't it true there are roughly 4,000 bureaucrats at the Department of Education, and there are 3,000 counties roughly in the United States? We could have one more teacher making, and they're very well paid. These bureaucrats on average are about $100,000. We could have one more teacher in every county in the United States if we, instead of using that money in a bureaucracy here in Washington, D.C., returned it to the states.
I don't know how many employees there are, but I will tell you there's like 3,300 counties, having been a county judge, so I know that number for sure.
I didn't know that we were both county judges then. Well, I appreciate your support for my amendment. I think it gets to the point. I've heard arguments on the other side of the aisle before you came here. They said that this 30-page bill from Republicans that adds 3 or 4 more requirements based on transparency will create a national school board, or that we somehow want to nationalize our school system. It sounded to me when I heard those words on the other side of the aisle earlier before you got here that they were in support of our amendment that you've co-sponsored. I mean, how do you feel about that characterization?
Well, I think I heard one of my colleagues here talk about, adamant about local control, if I remember his words. So I would just ask him to be adamant about local control as opposed to federal control.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
Thank you very much. Is there anyone else any other members seeking to testify on H.R. 5? None. Are there any other questions to any of the members of our panel? Okay, with that, I believe this is the first time all of you have come up here to the Rules Committee, so welcome. Please don't be strangers. We'd be happy to see you again on future matters, and with that, you're excused. Thank you very much. The chair's advised, are there any other people looking to testify? Chair's advised is about 10-minute. Okay, we'll close the hearing out. Seeing there's nobody else to testify, we'll close the hearing on H.R. 5. Chair's advised will be about 10 minutes before we're ready. At some point, there was supposed to be pizza in the other room? Pardon? No pizza? No pizza. We're ahead of schedule. So the staff is going to get the pizza when we're all down voting. But there are, you canceled it? Okay. Well, there are snacks in there if anybody cares to avail themselves. Otherwise, we'll recess, subject to call the chair. Hopefully, we'll be back here in a few minutes. Have the best coach in the world right next door. Okay, the chair will be in receipt of a motion from the gentlelady from Indiana, Ms. Houchin.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee grant H.R. 5, the Parents' Bill of Rights Act, a structured rule. The rule provides 2 hours of general debate, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Education and the Workforce or their respective designees. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 118-2 shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5 made in order as original text. The rule further makes in order only those amendments printed in the Rules Committee report. Each such amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question in the House or in the committee of the whole. All points of order against the amendments are waived. Finally, the rule provides one motion to recommit.
Thank you very much. You've now heard the motion. Is there any discussion or amendment to the rule?
First of all,
Gentlemen,
can I ask unanimous consent to insert into the record a statement from Representative Sheila Jackson-Lee?
without objection.
First of all, Mr. Chairman, we just want to express our disappointment with the rule. There were 36 Democratic amendments that were offered, and you made 3 in order. There were 22 Republican amendments made in order. You made 19 in order. And again, we obviously are not happy about that. Secondly, I just say before I offer amendments that there are some real problems that we're facing in our schools. There was a shooting today in one of our schools. It continues to be a problem. Kids are being killed in gun violence in our schools. We have students that are in schools that have lead pipes that can't drink the water that comes into the school. And rather than dealing with any of those things, which are real problems, we're dealing with this bill, H.R. 5, which basically puts politics over parents. This is a bill that brings divisive culture wars into our classrooms instead of delivering support and resources that our students and our teachers need. And I think it is harmful to our nation, and we will repeat over and over again, we believe that this bill makes it easier for people to ban books, which is happening all over the country right now. And I find that not only upsetting, but I find that I find it astounding that in the year 2023, we have to defend books like the book on Rosa Parks or books on Martin Luther King or Nelson Mandela that some Republican legislatures and governors find objectionable. I don't really get it. But in any event, this is a dangerous, dangerous bill. So I have an amendment to the rule. I move the committee make an order amendment number 16 to H.R. 5, offered by Representative Grijalva, which would prohibit the act to be construed to allowing the banning or censorship of books in public elementary or public secondary schools.
I would just note for the record that there's nothing in this legislation that deals with banning books at all. I think that's an important point to make. Is there any further discussion on the amendment? Hearing none, the questions on the gentleman's amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. No. The opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a recorded vote on that.
Recorded vote has been requested. The chair will, or excuse me, the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Burgess. No. Mr. Burgess, no. Mr. Reschenthaler. Mrs. Fishbach. No. Mrs. Fishbach votes no. Mr. Massey. No. Mr. Massey votes no. Mr. Norman. No. Mr. Norman votes no. Mr. Roy. No. Mr. Roy votes no. Mrs. Houchin. No. Mrs. Houchin votes no. Mr. Langworthy. No. Mr. Langworthy votes no. Mr. McGovern.
Yes.
Mr. McGovern votes yes. Ms. Scanlon. Yes. Ms. Scanlon votes yes. Mr. Neguse. Yes. Mr. Neguse votes yes. Ms. Leger-Fernandez. Mr. Chairman.
No.
Mr. Chairman votes no.
Clerk will report the total.
3 yeas, 8 nays.
And the noes have it. The amendment's not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, I have another amendment to the rule. I move the committee make an order amendment number 24 to H.R. 5 offered by Representative Landsman, which allows for individual school districts to opt out of compliance with the act in order to maintain local control.
Is there any further discussion on the amendment? Hearing none, the question's on the amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. No. The opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
I ask for your recorded vote.
Recorded vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess votes no. Mr. Reschenthaler. Mr. Reschenthaler votes no. Mrs. Fishbach. Mrs. Fishbach votes no. Mr. Massey. Mr. Massey votes no. Mr. Norman. Mr. Norman votes no. Mr. Roy. Mr. Roy votes no. Mrs. Houchin. Mrs. Houchin votes no. Mr. Langworthy. Mr. Langworthy votes no. Mr. McGovern.
Aye.
Mr. McGovern votes aye. Ms. Scanlon. Aye. Ms. Scanlon votes aye. Mr. Neguse. Mr. Neguse votes aye. Ms. Leger-Fernandez. Mr. Chairman.
No.
Mr. Chairman votes no.
Clerk will report the total.
3 yeas, 8 nays. Excuse me,
The noes have it. The amendment's not agreed to.
9.
The clerk will report the total.
3 yeas, 9 nays.
The amendment is not agreed to. Are there any further amendments? The young lady from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment to the rule. As we heard from Mr. Frost, H.R. 5 fails to recognize that all parents, including LGBTQI parents and parents of LGBTQI children, deserve to be able to send their children to a school where they and their families are affirmed and reflected in school curricula. Every parent wants laws that will ensure their children's safety and protection in schools, but H.R. 5 instead injects D.C. politics and culture wars into our neighborhood schools, creating hostile environments for certain students. So I move that the committee make an order amendment number 18 to H.R. 5 offered by Representative Frost, which would amend the sense of Congress on First Amendment rights to state that parents have a First Amendment right to express support for their children accessing best practice medical care.
Is there any further discussion on the amendment?
I would just add my strong support for this amendment, and I would say to my colleagues, even if you don't support it, that I hope you would make it an order, and we could debate this on the floor. But again, I would point out that of the 36 Democratic amendments that were offered, only 3 were made in order, and I think it would be a nice gesture to make this one in order.
Is there any further discussion? Hearing none, the question is on the amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. No. The opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
I would ask for a recorded vote.
Recorded vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Burgess. Votes no. Mr. Burgess votes no. Mr. Reschenthaler. No. Mr. Reschenthaler votes no. Mrs. Fishbach. No. Mrs. Fishbach votes no. Mr. Massey. No. Mr. Massey votes no. Mr. Norman. No. Mr. Norman votes no. Mr. Roy. No. Mr. Roy votes no. Mrs. Houchin. No. Mrs. Houchin votes no. Mr. Langworthy. No. Mr. Langworthy votes no. Mr. McGovern.
Aye.
Mr. McGovern votes aye. Ms. Scanlon. Aye. Ms. Scanlon votes aye. Mr. Neguse. Aye. Mr. Neguse votes aye. Ms. Leger-Fernandez. Mr. Chairman.
No.
Mr. Chairman votes no.
The clerk will report the total.
3 yeas, 9 nays.
The noes have it. The amendment's not agreed to. Are there additional amendments? Hearing none, no request for further amendments. The question's on the motion to report. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed say no.
No.
The opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
As for roll call.
Roll call vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Burgess. Burgess votes aye. Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Reschenthaler. Aye. Mr. Reschenthaler, aye. Mrs. Fishbach. Aye. Mrs. Fishbach, aye. Mr. Massey. Aye. Mr. Massey, aye. Mr. Norman. Aye. Mr. Norman, aye. Mr. Roy. Aye. Mr. Roy, aye. Mrs. Houchin. Aye. Mrs. Houchin, aye. Mr. Langworthy. Aye. Mr. Langworthy, aye. Mr. McGovern.
No.
Mr. McGovern, no. Ms. Scanlon. No. Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Neguse. No. Mr. Neguse, no. Ms. Leger-Fernandez. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, aye.
Clerk will report the total.
9 yeas, 3 nays.
The ayes have it. The motion to report is agreed to. Accordingly, Ms. Houchin will manage this rule for the majority.
Ms. Scanlon will manage it for the
Ms.
Democrats.
Scanlon will manage for the Democrats. Without objection, the committee is adjourned.